Why did certain ancient cities suddenly disappear? At the height of their power, some ancient cities seemed unstoppable. They controlled trade routes, commanded armies, fed tens of thousands of people, and reshaped landscapes through engineering and ambition. Their temples reached toward the sky. Their streets echoed with daily life. Their rulers believed their cities would last forever. And then, sometimes within a single generation, they vanished. Not gradually, not peacefully, but abruptly. Cities, once bustling with markets, rituals, and voices, fell silent. Buildings were abandoned mid-use. Homes were left with tools still inside. Streets filled with sand, ash, or jungle vines. In some cases, no written explanation survived. Only ruins remained, scattered across deserts, buried beneath forests, or submerged under water. The disappearance of ancient cities is one of history's most unsettling mysteries. Because these were not small villages, these were centers of civilization, places that should not have failed easily. And yet, they did. The question is not simply what happened to them, but how entire urban systems collapsed so completely that people never returned. To understand this, we must strip away the romantic myths of lost civilizations and examine the harsh realities of ancient life. Cities were fragile ecosystems. They depended on stable climate, reliable food supplies, political cooperation, and continuous maintenance. When one element failed, the effects cascaded. When several failed at once, collapse could be swift and irreversible. One of the first truths we must confront is this: ancient cities did not disappear for a single reason. There was no universal cause. Instead, cities vanished due to a deadly combination of pressures, environmental, political, economic, and social, that reinforced one another until recovery became impossible. Let's begin with a common misconception. Many people imagine ancient cities being wiped out overnight by massive catastrophes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or invading armies. And yes, in some cases that did happen. Pompeii was buried in a single day. Akrotiri vanished beneath volcanic ash. Cities along fault lines collapsed during earthquakes, but these dramatic events account for only a fraction of lost cities. Most ancient urban centers didn't die suddenly in a single moment of destruction. They died through collapse. Collapse is quieter, more insidious, and harder to see in the archaeological record. It begins with strain, then stress, then abandonment. Imagine a city that depends on a single river for water. A slight shift in rainfall patterns reduces crop yields. Food shortages emerge, prices rise, political tensions increase, people migrate outward. Tax revenue falls, infrastructure decays, disease spreads more easily, trade declines. Within a few decades, the city is no longer viable. No single disaster, just a chain reaction. One of the most powerful forces behind ancient city collapse was climate change. Long before modern industry, shifts in rainfall, temperature, and seasonal cycles reshaped entire regions. Droughts lasting decades could devastate agricultural systems. Flooding could erase infrastructure. Cooling periods shortened growing seasons. These changes were invisible at first, but devastating over time. Take the ancient Near East. Several Bronze Age cities collapsed around the same time, not because of invasion alone, but because prolonged drought weakened food systems across entire regions. Grain shortages led to unrest, armies weakened, trade collapsed. Cities that had survived for centuries suddenly could not sustain their populations. But climate alone does not explain abandonment. Political systems mattered just as much. Many ancient cities depended on centralized authority to coordinate food storage, irrigation, labor, and defense. When political stability failed, through corruption, succession crises, rebellion, or external pressure, the city's support systems collapsed with it. In some cases, rulers demanded too much from the population. Excessive taxation, forced labor, or rigid control pushed people to leave voluntarily. In others, elites hoarded resources while ordinary people suffered. Over time, cities hollowed out from the inside. Another overlooked factor is infrastructure decay. Ancient cities required constant maintenance. Roads had to be repaired, canals had to be dredged, walls had to be rebuilt, drainage systems needed clearing. When labor shortages or political breakdown interrupted maintenance, cities became less livable year by year. A clogged canal meant flooding. A broken road meant trade disruptions. A neglected wall meant vulnerability. Once maintenance stopped, cities entered a downward spiral. And then there is the most human factor of all, choice. People did not always flee in panic. Often they simply stopped returning. If farmland became unproductive, people moved closer to water. If trade routes shifted, merchants followed them. If political power relocated, administrative cities emptied out. Over time, abandonment became permanent. Archaeologists often find evidence of this quiet departure: homes cleared of valuables, workshops left orderly, temples stripped of offerings. These were not scenes of chaos, but of deliberate departure. This raises an unsettling question. How many ancient cities disappeared not because they were destroyed, but because people collectively decided they were no longer worth saving? The ruins we see today are not always monuments to disaster. Sometimes they are monuments to resignation. In the coming parts of this documentary, we will explore the most famous vanished cities in the ancient world. We will examine why the Maya abandoned vast urban centers in the jungle, why Mesopotamian cities turned to dust, why Indus Valley cities were deserted despite advanced planning, why powerful Mediterranean cities declined and were forgotten. And as we do, a disturbing pattern will emerge. The forces that destroyed ancient cities are not ancient at all. They are familiar. They are recurring. And in many ways, they are still with us. Because the real mystery is not why ancient cities disappeared. It's why we keep building societies that fail in the same ways. One of the most unsettling aspects of ancient city collapse is how often these events happened in clusters rather than isolation. Entire regions experienced waves of abandonment within a relatively short span of time, suggesting that the forces behind collapse were not local accidents but systemic pressures affecting multiple societies at once. When archaeologists step back and look at the timelines, patterns emerge that transform isolated mysteries into a shared human story of vulnerability and adaptation. Nowhere is this more visible than in the Late Bronze Age, a period that saw the sudden disappearance of many powerful cities across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Cities that had thrived for centuries, connected by trade networks stretching from Egypt to Anatolia, began to fail almost simultaneously. Ports fell silent, palaces burned, administrative systems vanished. For decades, scholars argued over whether this collapse was caused by invasions, earthquakes, or internal revolts. The answer, as it turns out, is far more complex and far more disturbing. Climate data extracted from ice cores, lake sediments, and ancient pollen records reveal a prolonged period of drought beginning around the 13th century BCE. Rainfall declined sharply across large portions of the Mediterranean and Near East. Rivers shrank, harvests failed. Agricultural systems that depended on predictable seasons collapsed under the strain. Cities that had relied on imported grain suddenly found trade routes unreliable, while local food production could no longer sustain urban populations. As food shortages spread, political stability eroded. Kings, who had once ruled through centralized bureaucracy and surplus redistribution, found themselves unable to meet the basic needs of their people. Grain storage facilities emptied, rations were cut, laborers abandoned public works. In many cases, city authorities responded by increasing demands on the population, enforcing harsher taxes and compulsory labor to compensate for dwindling resources. These measures only accelerated social breakdown. Trade networks, which had once acted as lifelines, became liabilities. Ancient cities were deeply interconnected, relying on long-distance exchange for metals, timber, food, and luxury goods. When drought weakened one region, the ripple effects spread outward. A city that depended on imported copper or grain could collapse even if its own environment remained relatively stable. Once enough cities failed, the entire system unraveled. What makes this collapse particularly haunting is how quickly urban life became unsustainable. Archaeological evidence shows that some cities were abandoned within a generation. Houses were left with storage jars still in place. Workshops were deserted mid-production. Administrative buildings stopped issuing records. It was not a dramatic annihilation, but a quiet evacuation, a collective recognition that the city could no longer function. This pattern repeats across history because cities are fragile by design. They concentrate people, resources, and power into dense spaces that depend on constant input. Unlike small villages, which can adapt quickly and spread risk across landscapes, cities magnify failure. When food systems fail, cities starve first. When water systems break, cities suffer immediately. When political coordination falters, cities descend into chaos faster than rural areas. Another critical factor behind sudden abandonment was environmental mismanagement. Many ancient cities were built in marginal environments where survival depended on careful balance. Irrigation systems in Mesopotamia allowed agriculture in arid lands, but over time, salt buildup in the soil reduced crop yields. Forests were cleared for fuel and construction, leading to erosion and reduced rainfall retention. Once the land was degraded, the city lost its agricultural base. The collapse of Mesopotamian cities, such as Ur and Lagash, illustrates this perfectly. These cities did not fall because of invasion or disaster alone. They declined because their irrigation systems, once a triumph of engineering, slowly poisoned the soil. Crop yields dropped. Food shortages increased. People left for more fertile regions. Eventually, the cities were no longer viable, and their once great canals filled with silt and sand. In other cases, the environment turned hostile in sudden and unpredictable ways. Shifting river courses abandoned cities that had been built around waterways. Floods destroyed infrastructure beyond repair. Desertification crept into once fertile regions. When a city lost its water source, relocation became inevitable. Archaeologists have identified numerous ancient cities abandoned after rivers changed course, leaving behind ports with no water and fields with no irrigation. Disease also played a silent but devastating role. Dense urban populations, combined with poor sanitation and weakened immune systems during times of famine, created perfect conditions for epidemics. While ancient texts rarely describe disease outbreaks in detail, mass graves, sudden population decline, and abandoned neighborhoods suggest that epidemics accelerated the collapse of already strained cities. When enough people died or fled, maintaining essential services became impossible. But perhaps the most revealing factor behind ancient city abandonment is human decision-making. Cities did not vanish simply because people were forced out. Often they were left because better options appeared elsewhere. New trade routes opened, more fertile lands were discovered, political power shifted to new centers. Over time, the cost of staying outweighed the benefits of leaving. This challenges the idea that collapse is always violent or sudden. In many cases, it was gradual, rational, and even strategic. Families moved first, then merchants, then officials. Finally, the city emptied, not in panic, but in stages, until silence replaced activity. What remains behind are ruins that appear mysterious only because we imagine cities as permanent. In reality, ancient people understood impermanence well. They knew when to walk away. The ruins we study today are not just the remains of failure, but evidence of adaptation. As we continue, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why did some civilizations abandon multiple cities at once, while others managed to survive and reorganize? Why did certain urban centers vanish forever, while nearby settlements continued to thrive? The answer lies in how societies responded to stress, how flexible their systems were, and how deeply they depended on fragile environmental and political foundations. And in the next part, we will turn our attention to one of the most famous examples of urban disappearance in human history. The cities of the ancient Maya, swallowed by jungle and silence, leaving behind questions that still challenge researchers today. Few ancient disappearances have captured the imagination quite like the sudden abandonment of the great Maya cities of Central America. Deep in the jungles of modern-day Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras lie vast stone cities once filled with towering pyramids, palaces, ceremonial plazas, and complex road systems. At their peak, these cities supported millions of people, maintained advanced calendars, practiced sophisticated astronomy, and produced some of the most intricate art of the ancient world. And yet, between roughly 800 and 950 CE, many of these urban centers were quietly deserted. For centuries, explorers and scholars struggled to explain how a civilization capable of such achievements could seemingly vanish. Early theories blamed foreign invasion or mysterious plagues, but archaeology has revealed a far more complex and unsettling reality. The Maya did not disappear overnight, nor were they wiped out by a single catastrophe. Instead, their cities were abandoned through a slow, cascading collapse driven by environmental stress, political instability, and systemic fragility. One of the most critical factors behind Maya urban collapse was water. Unlike civilizations that flourished along great rivers, many Maya cities were built in regions with limited surface water. They depended heavily on seasonal rainfall stored in reservoirs, cisterns, and natural depressions. For generations, this system worked, but it left the Maya dangerously vulnerable to climate fluctuations. Paleoclimate data now shows that the Maya heartland experienced a series of severe droughts during the late Classic period, some lasting decades. As rainfall declined, reservoirs failed to refill, crops withered, and food shortages spread. Maize, the backbone of Maya agriculture and culture, became increasingly difficult to grow consistently. This strain affected not just farmers, but the entire urban system. Cities required constant food inflow to sustain large populations, artisans, priests, and elites who did not produce food themselves. When the agricultural base weakened, the entire structure above it began to crack. But drought alone does not explain why cities were abandoned rather than adapted. The deeper issue was how Maya society was organized. Maya cities were ruled by powerful elites who derived their authority from religious legitimacy, ritual performance, and claims of divine favor. When environmental stress increased, rulers were expected to intercede with the gods, perform ceremonies, and restore balance. When rains failed year after year, faith in leadership eroded. Political competition intensified as resources dwindled. Warfare between city-states became more frequent and more destructive. Fortifications increased, trade routes broke down, alliances collapsed. Archaeological evidence shows a surge in violent conflict during the final decades of many Maya cities, with fortresses built hastily and monuments defaced or left unfinished. This violence compounded existing stress. Farmers fled conflict zones. Trade networks fragmented. Labor shortages reduced the ability to maintain reservoirs, terraces, and infrastructure. Cities became less functional with each passing year. Once maintenance stopped, recovery became unlikely. Perhaps most revealing is what archaeologists find inside abandoned Maya homes. There is no evidence of mass destruction or panic. Instead, dwellings appear to have been emptied carefully. Valuable items were taken. Structures were left intact. People did not flee in terror. They left deliberately, moving toward regions with more reliable water sources or better agricultural conditions. Some Maya populations relocated to the northern Yucatan, where cities like Chichen Itza later flourished. This tells us something critical. The Maya civilization did not collapse entirely. Their urban system did. The people adapted by changing where and how they lived. The Maya case exposes a key truth about ancient cities. They were not resilient in the way modern societies imagine resilience. They were finely tuned systems that worked brilliantly under stable conditions, but failed rapidly when those conditions changed. Their success created vulnerability. The more complex the city, the more dependent it became on predictable inputs. The Maya also illustrate another crucial factor in sudden urban disappearance: elite overinvestment. Monumental construction continued even as conditions worsened. Resources were poured into temples, stelae, and palaces, while agricultural systems struggled. This imbalance reflects a leadership class prioritizing legitimacy and display over long-term sustainability. When collapse came, it was not sudden because people were unaware. It was sudden because adaptation came too late. Jungle overgrowth eventually erased visible signs of abandonment, creating the illusion of mystery. Trees grew through plazas, roots cracked stone. Wildlife reclaimed the streets. To later observers, it appeared as if the Maya had vanished into the forest. In reality, they walked away, and this pattern repeats elsewhere. Ancient cities often disappeared not because they were destroyed, but because they became unlivable. Environmental stress exposed political weaknesses. Political failures accelerated economic decline. Economic collapse reduced the ability to maintain infrastructure. Infrastructure failure made survival impossible. The Maya story forces us to confront an uncomfortable idea. Civilization does not collapse when people stop caring. It collapses when systems lose flexibility, when leaders double down on old solutions instead of adapting to new realities, when societies prioritize appearance over function, when resilience is assumed instead of built. As we move forward, another ancient civilization presents an equally haunting mystery. Thousands of years before the Maya collapse, a network of meticulously planned cities rose along the Indus River system, featuring advanced sanitation, standardized architecture, and efficient urban design. Then, just as quietly, these cities were abandoned, leaving behind one of the greatest unanswered questions in archaeology. In the next part, we will explore why the cities of the Indus Valley disappeared and what their collapse reveals about the dangers of environmental change, shifting rivers, and the limits of even the most sophisticated urban planning. Long before the collapse of the Maya cities, another civilization built urban centers so orderly and advanced that modern archaeologists still struggle to explain how they functioned with such precision. Along the rivers of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, the Indus Valley civilization constructed cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and Dholavira, featuring straight streets laid out in grids, standardized bricks, sophisticated drainage systems, and an absence of ostentatious palaces or royal tombs. These cities appeared stable, efficient, and remarkably well planned. And then, between roughly 1900 and 1300 BCE, they were gradually abandoned. Unlike many other ancient collapses, the disappearance of Indus Valley cities left almost no written explanation. The civilization's script remains undeciphered, and there are no surviving texts describing wars, disasters, or divine punishment. Instead, archaeologists are left with physical clues, environmental data, and patterns of settlement that reveal a collapse driven not by sudden catastrophe, but by slow, relentless environmental transformation. For generations, Indus cities depended on a complex river system that included the Indus itself and several now vanished tributaries. These rivers provided water for agriculture, trade routes for commerce, and stability for urban life. But rivers are not fixed features. Over time, tectonic shifts and changes in monsoon patterns altered river courses dramatically. One major river system, likely the Ghaggar Hakra, began to dry up, transforming once fertile plains into arid landscapes. As rivers shifted or vanished, cities lost their lifelines. Irrigated fields failed, water tables dropped. Trade routes collapsed as waterways became unreliable. Unlike river civilizations such as Egypt, where the Nile's predictability provided stability, the Indus system proved far more vulnerable to climatic fluctuation. Paleoclimate evidence shows a weakening of monsoon rains during this period, reducing water availability across the region. What makes this collapse particularly striking is how orderly it appears. Excavations show no widespread destruction layers, no burned cities, no signs of mass violence. Instead, population density declines gradually. Large cities shrink. Standardized brick sizes change, suggesting decentralization and loss of centralized authority. Public infrastructure falls into disrepair. Drainage systems clog. Maintenance ceases. This pattern suggests not panic, but adaptation. As conditions worsened, people began relocating to smaller villages closer to remaining water sources. Urban life became less viable, while rural subsistence offered greater flexibility. The Indus Valley civilization did not collapse because people failed. It collapsed because urban concentration no longer made sense. Another factor may have been economic transformation. Indus cities thrived on long-distance trade, exchanging goods with Mesopotamia and other regions. As environmental stress reduced agricultural surplus, trade volume likely declined. Without surplus, specialized craftspeople and administrators could not be supported. The complex economic networks that sustained urban life unraveled. What is perhaps most fascinating is what the Indus collapse lacks. There is no evidence of tyrannical elites clinging to power, no desperate last monuments, no militarization in response to crisis. Unlike the Maya, there are no signs of increased warfare or defensive structures. The collapse appears almost peaceful. People left because staying was no longer practical. This challenges a deeply ingrained assumption about collapse. Not all civilizations fall through violence or disaster. Some simply dissolve. Urban systems can fade when the conditions that sustain them disappear. The Indus Valley case reminds us that even the most rational, efficient urban planning cannot overcome environmental realities indefinitely. Yet there is another layer to this disappearance. After the cities were abandoned, the Indus cultural tradition did not vanish. People continued to live in the region. They adapted their lifestyles, technologies, and settlement patterns. The civilization transformed rather than ended. Urbanism receded, but human continuity remained. This raises a critical question. Why did people not rebuild the cities once conditions improved? Why were these urban centers never reoccupied on the same scale? One likely answer lies in memory. Once a place becomes associated with hardship, unreliability, or failure, societies often choose new beginnings elsewhere. Cities are not just physical spaces, they are psychological commitments. The Indus collapse also reveals something deeply modern. Highly optimized systems, while efficient, often lack resilience. The Indus cities were masterpieces of planning, but they depended on stable environmental inputs. When those inputs changed, flexibility was limited. Smaller, less complex settlements adapted more easily. As we move forward in this exploration, we encounter another set of vanished cities shaped not by drought or rivers, but by volcanic fire, earthquakes, and sudden geological catastrophe. These cities did not fade gradually. They were frozen in time, preserving moments of life in terrifying detail. In the next part, we will examine how natural disasters caused some ancient cities to disappear almost instantly, and why these sudden catastrophes reveal just as much about human vulnerability as slow collapse ever could. While many ancient cities disappeared through slow decline and quiet abandonment, others vanished in moments so sudden and violent that time itself seemed to stop. These cities were not gradually emptied. They were erased by natural forces that gave their inhabitants little warning and no chance to adapt. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and sudden floods froze daily life in place, preserving haunting snapshots of civilization at the exact moment of catastrophe. Perhaps the most famous example is Pompeii, a thriving Roman city buried beneath volcanic ash in 79 CE, when Mount Vesuvius erupted with extraordinary force. In a matter of hours, streets that had been alive with trade and conversation were smothered. Roofs collapsed under the weight of falling ash. People sought shelter where they stood. Homes, shops, temples, and even food left cooking on hearths were sealed beneath layers of debris. Pompeii did not slowly disappear. It was silenced instantly. Yet what makes Pompeii so important to our understanding of vanished cities is not just the eruption itself, but what it reveals about urban vulnerability. Pompeii was prosperous, well-connected, and culturally vibrant. Its destruction had nothing to do with political failure, climate change, or economic collapse. It was wiped out by geography. The city existed because volcanic soil was fertile and trade routes were favorable, but those same conditions carried hidden danger. The forces that sustain cities can also destroy them. Pompeii was not alone. Nearby, Herculaneum suffered an even more intense fate, engulfed by superheated pyroclastic flows that killed instantly and buried the city under hardened volcanic material. Unlike Pompeii's slow suffocation under ash, Herculaneum was erased in seconds. Wood was carbonized. Human remains show no signs of struggle. The city ceased to exist before its inhabitants understood what was happening. These disasters reveal something unsettling. Ancient people often knew the risks they lived with. Earthquakes were common. Volcanoes loomed visibly on the horizon. Floodplains flooded. But cities were built anyway. Why? Because the benefits of fertile land, trade access, and strategic positioning outweighed distant threats. People accepted risk in exchange for prosperity, a calculation repeated throughout history. Another dramatic example comes from the Bronze Age city of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini. Akrotiri was a sophisticated settlement with multi-story buildings, advanced drainage, and vibrant frescoes depicting daily life. Around 1600 BCE, a massive volcanic eruption devastated the island. Ash blanketed the city. Buildings collapsed. Tsunamis rippled outward across the Aegean. What makes Akrotiri especially intriguing is that few human remains have been found. This suggests that residents may have evacuated before the eruption, perhaps after early warning signs, such as earthquakes. If true, Akrotiri stands as a rare example of a city abandoned successfully ahead of disaster. Yet, even successful evacuation led to permanent disappearance. The city was never rebuilt. Ash, shifting coastlines, and altered trade networks made return impossible. Earthquakes alone have also erased cities. In ancient Anatolia, the Levant, and Greece, entire urban centers were destroyed by seismic events. Walls collapsed, water systems broke, fires spread. In some cases, cities were rebuilt. In others, repeated earthquakes convinced survivors to leave for safer ground. Archaeologists often find layers of destruction separated by rebuilding phases, followed eventually by abandonment. Disaster did not always end a city immediately, but it weakened its resilience. Floods played a similar role. Cities built along rivers thrived because of water access, but extreme flooding could overwhelm infrastructure. In Mesopotamia, flood layers found in archaeological sites suggest that catastrophic inundations periodically devastated settlements. When flood frequency increased or recovery resources diminished, cities were abandoned. Floods erased not only buildings but social confidence. Once a city became associated with danger, relocation became a rational choice. Even tsunamis reshaped ancient urban landscapes. Coastal settlements around the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean were vulnerable to seismic sea waves. Archaeological evidence suggests that some ancient port cities were destroyed by sudden flooding and never reoccupied. When harbors silted up or coastlines changed, trade collapsed. Without trade, port cities died. What ties all these catastrophes together is not just destruction, but finality. In many cases, the environment itself changed so drastically that rebuilding was impractical. Volcanic ash rendered land unusable for years. Earthquakes altered water tables. Tsunamis destroyed harbors permanently. Even when survivors remained, the economic and geographic logic of the city was gone. Yet natural disasters alone cannot explain why some cities vanished while others recovered. Rome burned multiple times and survived. Constantinople endured earthquakes and rebuilt repeatedly. The difference lies in resources, political organization, and regional stability. Cities embedded in strong networks could recover. Isolated cities could not. Another haunting aspect of sudden disaster cities is how they preserve human behavior. In Pompeii, graffiti still clings to walls, shops remain stocked. In Akrotiri, paintings depict rituals and landscapes frozen in time. These cities remind us that collapse is not always a slow process visible in advance. Sometimes it arrives without warning, indifferent to human planning. But even here, disaster is rarely the sole cause. Many of these cities existed in fragile equilibrium long before catastrophe struck. Economic inequality, overpopulation, or political strain made recovery harder. Disaster acted as a final blow rather than the sole trigger. This leads to a critical realization: cities do not disappear simply because disaster happens. They disappear when disaster overwhelms their ability to recover. Resilience, not avoidance, determines survival. As we move forward, another form of disappearance emerges, one driven not by nature, but by human conflict. Entire cities were erased through warfare, conquest, and deliberate destruction. Some were burned and never rebuilt. Others were emptied through forced relocation. These disappearances reveal how power, violence, and political ambition reshaped the ancient urban world. In the next part, we will explore how war and conquest caused ancient cities to vanish, and why some victories resulted not in occupation, but in permanent abandonment. While nature erased some ancient cities without warning, others were deliberately wiped from the map by human hands. War, conquest, and political violence played a decisive role in the disappearance of many urban centers, not merely through destruction, but through intentional abandonment. In these cases, cities did not vanish because people could not live there, but because they were no longer allowed to, or because rebuilding was no longer worth the cost after devastation. In the ancient world, cities were symbols of power. To conquer a city was to dominate its people, its economy, and its gods. But to destroy a city completely was to erase a rival's identity and ensure it would never rise again. Some conquerors occupied cities and repurposed them. Others made an example of them, turning thriving centers into warnings written in stone and ash. One of the clearest examples of war-driven disappearance comes from the ancient Near East, where empires rose and fell in rapid succession. Assyrian kings, in particular, practiced deliberate urban destruction as a tool of psychological warfare. Cities that resisted were razed, their walls torn down, temples burned, and populations deported. These cities were not meant to recover. Their destruction was intended to break resistance across entire regions. Archaeological layers show cities burned so thoroughly that rebuilding would have required enormous effort and resources. In many cases, survivors were relocated hundreds of kilometers away, removing the human memory and labor needed to restore the city. Without people, a city is only stone. Once abandoned, weather, erosion, and scavenging quickly reduced these places to ruins, yet conquest did not always involve fire and slaughter. Sometimes cities disappeared because they were strategically sidelined. When empires shifted trade routes, administrative centers, or capitals, once important cities lost their purpose. Merchants followed new roads. Officials moved to new seats of power. Soldiers were stationed elsewhere. Over time, cities emptied without a single battle. This phenomenon is visible across the Mediterranean. As Roman power expanded, some older Greek and Phoenician cities declined, not because they were destroyed, but because they were bypassed. Trade flowed toward Rome and its favored ports. Cities that had thrived for centuries found themselves isolated. Without economic relevance, maintenance ceased. Populations dwindled. Eventually, abandonment followed. The fall of Carthage demonstrates another form of war-induced disappearance. After centuries of rivalry with Rome, Carthage was finally defeated in 146 BCE. The city was systematically destroyed, buildings were dismantled, fields were reportedly salted, though this may be symbolic rather than literal. The population was killed or enslaved. For generations, Carthage remained largely uninhabited, its ruins serving as a reminder of Rome's power. What makes Carthage particularly revealing is that its location was ideal. It had access to trade routes, fertile land, and harbors. Its disappearance was not environmental, it was political. Only centuries later, when Rome itself chose to rebuild on the site, did urban life return. This shows that disappearance is often a choice imposed by power, not fate. Elsewhere, cities vanished through cycles of conquest that left them economically and demographically exhausted. In Mesopotamia, cities were repeatedly captured, sacked, rebuilt, and captured again. Each cycle drained resources and population. Eventually, some cities reached a point where rebuilding no longer made sense. The costs outweighed the benefits. People relocated to safer, more stable centers. Forced relocation was another powerful driver of urban disappearance. Empires often moved entire populations to weaken resistance and strengthen control elsewhere. When a city lost its people, it lost its function. Administrative buildings stood empty, fields went untilled, infrastructure decayed. Within decades, the city ceased to exist as a living place. In some cases, conquest altered cultural identity so completely that cities lost their original meaning. Sacred centers were desecrated, religious practices were banned, local elites were removed. Without cultural continuity, people had little incentive to rebuild. The city's identity died even if its stones remained. War also interacted with environmental stress in deadly ways. A city weakened by drought or famine was less able to defend itself. A city damaged by siege struggled to recover if harvests failed. These overlapping crises created tipping points. Once crossed, abandonment became inevitable. The disappearance of cities through warfare challenges another common myth, that conquerors always wanted cities intact. In reality, ancient warfare was often about disruption, not occupation. Destroying a city could secure borders, intimidate rivals, or eliminate economic competition. In such cases, abandonment was the goal. Yet not all war-damaged cities vanished forever. Some rebuilt and adapted. The difference lay in geography, resources, and political stability. Cities located at crossroads or near valuable resources were more likely to be rebuilt. Others, especially those in marginal areas, were left to decay. This leads to a critical realization. Urban survival depended less on strength than on relevance. Cities that remained useful to those in power survived. Cities that did not were allowed to disappear. But warfare was only one part of the equation. Some cities vanished not because they were attacked, but because they were slowly drained of meaning by shifting economies and technologies. As trade patterns changed and new innovations emerged, entire urban networks became obsolete. In the next part, we will explore how economic shifts, changing trade routes, and technological transitions caused ancient cities to fade away, not through destruction, but through irrelevance, revealing how progress itself can leave ruins in its wake. Not every ancient city vanished in flames or famine. Some disappeared for a quieter, more unsettling reason. They were left behind by history itself. As economies evolved, technologies changed, and trade routes shifted, cities that once sat at the center of the world found themselves slowly drained of purpose. No catastrophe announced their end. No final battle marked their fall. Instead, relevance moved elsewhere, and people followed. Ancient cities lived or died by connection. Trade routes were their arteries. When goods flowed through a city, wealth followed. When those routes shifted, cities withered. This dynamic played out repeatedly across history, often faster than anyone expected. Consider the ancient cities of Central Asia that once thrived along early Silk Road routes. These cities existed because caravans passed through them, carrying silk, spices, metals, and ideas between East and West. Inns, markets, warehouses, and workshops sprang up to serve travelers. Entire urban economies depended on the steady movement of trade. But trade routes are not fixed. When political instability made one path dangerous, merchants found alternatives. When maritime trade expanded, overland routes declined. When camels replaced donkeys, routes changed again. Cities that were once indispensable suddenly found themselves bypassed. As caravans stopped arriving, markets emptied. Artisans lost customers. Tax revenue collapsed. Infrastructure decayed. Without trade, these cities had no reason to exist. Many were abandoned not because they failed, but because the world no longer needed them. A similar fate befell many ancient port cities. Harbors that once teemed with ships slowly silted up as coastlines shifted or rivers deposited sediment. Maintaining harbors required constant dredging and engineering. When political power weakened or funds dried up, ports became unusable. Ships went elsewhere. Trade followed deeper harbors. Entire cities that depended on maritime commerce were left stranded inland, their docks dry and their warehouses empty. The Mediterranean world is filled with such examples. Once important ports faded into obscurity when new harbors rose nearby. Even slight changes in sea level or sediment flow could alter maritime geography enough to doom a city. Without ships, port cities were nothing more than stone shells. Technological change accelerated this process. New forms of transport reshaped economic landscapes. When wheeled carts improved, roads mattered more than rivers. When sailing technology advanced, long-distance sea trade replaced coastal hopping. Cities optimized for older systems struggled to adapt. Infrastructure built for one era became obsolete in the next. Economic specialization also created vulnerability. Many ancient cities thrived because they controlled a single resource or industry. Mining towns flourished near silver or copper deposits. Textile centers dominated regional markets. Administrative capitals existed because bureaucracy needed a home. But when resources ran out, markets collapsed, or political systems changed, specialization became a liability. Cities built around one function had no backup. This is why some cities vanished, even while neighboring settlements survived. Smaller towns, with diversified economies and flexible structures, adapted more easily. Large, specialized cities could not. Political decisions often accelerated economic abandonment. When rulers founded new capitals, old ones declined rapidly. Administrative staff moved. Tax collection shifted. Investment followed power. Former capitals, once buzzing with officials and merchants, emptied almost overnight. Without government support, their economies collapsed. This phenomenon can be seen in ancient China, where dynastic changes repeatedly shifted capitals. Cities that lost political favor declined, sometimes disappearing entirely. New capitals rose elsewhere, drawing people and resources away. Urban life was mobile, following authority rather than geography alone. Religion played a similar role. Sacred cities thrived as pilgrimage centers, supported by donations and ritual economies. When religious practices changed or sacred status shifted, these cities lost their lifeblood. Temples fell into disuse. Pilgrims stopped coming. Economies built on belief dissolved. The most unsettling aspect of economic abandonment is how rational it was. People did not cling to failing cities out of sentiment. They moved toward opportunity. Merchants followed profit. Farmers followed fertile land. Officials followed power. Over time, abandonment became the logical outcome of countless individual decisions. Archaeological evidence reflects this gradual exit. Homes were stripped of valuables, public buildings were repurposed briefly, then left empty. There are no destruction layers, no mass graves, no signs of panic, just silence. This challenges the dramatic narratives often associated with lost cities. Collapse does not always mean chaos. Sometimes it means choice. Yet economic abandonment rarely occurred in isolation. It often intersected with other stresses. A city weakened by drought was more vulnerable to trade decline. A city damaged by war struggled to attract merchants. A city suffering political instability lost investor confidence. These overlapping pressures created tipping points beyond which recovery was impossible. What makes this pattern so powerful is its familiarity. Even today, cities rise and fall with economic shifts. Industrial towns decline when factories close. Port cities fade when shipping routes change. Capitals lose influence when governments relocate. The ancient world was no different, only less forgiving. Once a city was abandoned, nature reclaimed it quickly. Stone was quarried for nearby construction, timber rotted, roads vanished under soil and vegetation. Within centuries, once great cities became little more than mounds, their names forgotten until rediscovered by archaeologists. This raises a sobering question. How many ancient cities disappeared not because they were destroyed, but because they were forgotten? How many urban centers faded so quietly that history never recorded their end? As we move forward, another powerful force emerges, one that often worked alongside economic decline, but deserves special attention: social breakdown. Inequality, unrest, and loss of trust eroded cities from within, making them vulnerable to every external shock. When social cohesion failed, cities became ungovernable, accelerating abandonment. In the next part, we will explore how internal social fractures caused ancient cities to unravel, revealing that sometimes the greatest threat to a city came not from outside forces, but from the breakdown of the society living within its walls. When ancient cities disappeared, the causes were not always environmental or military. In many cases, the collapse began inside the city itself, driven by social tension, inequality, and the slow erosion of trust between rulers and the ruled. These internal fractures rarely announce themselves dramatically. Instead, they weaken societies quietly, making cities brittle long before any external shock delivers the final blow. Cities depend on cooperation. People must believe that shared systems, laws, leadership, labor, and resource distribution are worth supporting. When that belief breaks down, cities lose their ability to function as collective entities. Ancient history provides countless examples of urban centers that collapsed not because they ran out of resources, but because their societies stopped working together. One of the most dangerous sources of instability was inequality. Many ancient cities concentrated wealth, power, and privilege in the hands of a small elite, while the majority of the population struggled to survive. As long as food was abundant and stability maintained, this imbalance could persist. But when conditions worsened through drought, trade disruption, or war, the gap between elites and common people became impossible to ignore. Archaeological evidence often reveals this imbalance in the final phases of cities. Elite residences continue to expand or receive luxury goods even as ordinary housing shrinks or deteriorates. Monumental construction persists, while infrastructure serving the broader population decays. These patterns suggest leadership prioritizing status and control over resilience and reform. This imbalance eroded legitimacy. Rulers in many ancient societies claimed divine favor or ancestral authority. When crises struck and leaders failed to protect the population, these claims rang hollow. People lost faith not just in individuals, but in the systems that sustained the city itself. Social unrest followed. In some cities, violence erupted. In others, resistance took quieter forms: refusal to pay taxes, abandonment of public labor projects, or migration away from urban centers. Each act weakened the city's ability to respond to crisis. Migration played a particularly powerful role. Cities require a constant flow of labor to maintain infrastructure, produce goods, and sustain institutions. When people began leaving, whether for safer regions, better farmland, or emerging centers, the city entered a downward spiral. Fewer workers meant less maintenance. Less maintenance meant poorer living conditions. Poor conditions drove more people away. This feedback loop appears repeatedly in the archaeological record. Late-phase cities often show reduced population density, abandoned neighborhoods, and shrinking public spaces. Entire districts fall silent while others remain briefly occupied. Eventually, even the core empties. Social fragmentation also undermined security. Cities with weakened cohesion were less able to defend themselves against external threats. Fortifications went unrepaired. Militias lacked recruits. Invaders encountered little resistance. Even rumors of attack could trigger mass departure when trust in leadership had already collapsed. Another critical factor was the breakdown of shared identity. Cities were more than economic centers. They were cultural communities. Rituals, festivals, and collective practices reinforced belonging. When social stress disrupted these traditions, cities lost their emotional glue. People no longer saw urban life as meaningful or protective. In some cases, religious or ideological shifts accelerated fragmentation. Changes in belief systems undermined traditional authority structures. Sacred centers lost influence. Temples closed. Priestly classes declined. Without shared spiritual frameworks, social cohesion weakened further. The late Roman Empire offers a powerful illustration. As economic pressures mounted and political authority fractured, trust in institutions eroded. Urban populations declined as people moved to rural estates or fortified villages. Public baths closed, forums emptied, civic pride dissolved. Cities that had once symbolized Roman order became liabilities rather than assets. This pattern was not unique to Rome. Similar dynamics unfolded in Mesopotamia, Greece, and Mesoamerica. Cities that could not adapt socially by redistributing resources, reforming leadership, or integrating new identities lost their populations long before walls fell. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of social collapse is how invisible it can be archaeologically. Unlike fires or earthquakes, social breakdown leaves no clear destruction layer. Instead, it appears as absence, missing repairs, empty homes, declining craftsmanship, fewer inscriptions, less trade. These absences tell a story of people disengaging from the urban project. They stopped investing effort because they no longer believed the city would protect or reward them. Importantly, social collapse rarely acted alone. It amplified other stresses. Environmental crises hit harder when societies were divided. Wars were more destructive when cities lacked unity. Economic shifts were more damaging when trust was already gone. This interconnectedness explains why cities that survived one crisis collapsed under another. Resilience depended not just on resources, but on social bonds. Cities that maintained trust, flexibility, and inclusion could adapt. Those that did not fractured. And yet, even as cities fell apart, people did not vanish. They reorganized. They formed smaller communities. They adapted new identities. Collapse was not the end of society. It was the end of a particular way of organizing life. This distinction matters. When we see abandoned cities, it is tempting to imagine disappearance as failure. But from another perspective, it was transformation. People chose survival over urban loyalty. As we move into the next part, we will explore one final force that ties together environmental stress, economic decline, warfare, and social fragmentation. Overcomplexity. The very systems that made ancient cities powerful also made them fragile. When complexity outpaced resilience, collapse became inevitable. In the next part, we will examine how ancient cities collapsed under the weight of their own success and why complexity itself can become a fatal weakness. One of the most overlooked reasons ancient cities disappeared is also one of the most uncomfortable to confront. Many collapsed, not despite their sophistication, but because of it. As cities grew more complex, interconnected, and specialized, they became increasingly fragile. Systems that worked brilliantly under ideal conditions struggled to adapt when stress entered the equation. Over time, complexity itself became a liability. Ancient cities were not just clusters of buildings, they were networks of dependencies. Food production relied on irrigation systems that required constant maintenance. Trade depended on stable routes and political agreements. Governance required administrators, record-keeping, enforcement, and legitimacy. Religion demanded temples, rituals, and priestly classes. Defense required walls, soldiers, and supply chains. Each system depended on the others. When one failed, it strained the rest. At a certain point, cities became too complex to manage without surplus. As long as resources flowed in steadily, complexity created efficiency and power. But when surplus declined, complexity turned into burden. Administrations became bloated. Infrastructure became expensive to maintain. Social obligations multiplied. The cost of keeping the city running exceeded what the environment and population could support. This pattern is visible across multiple civilizations. Late-stage cities often show signs of administrative overload. Records become inconsistent. Building quality declines. Repairs become patchy. Public projects are abandoned halfway. These are not signs of ignorance or incompetence. They are signs of systems stretched beyond capacity. One of the clearest examples comes from late Bronze Age palace societies. These cities relied heavily on centralized bureaucracies to manage food distribution, labor, and trade. When climate stress disrupted agriculture and trade routes collapsed, the bureaucratic systems that once provided stability became rigid and slow to respond. Decision-making bottlenecks formed. Local adaptation was suppressed in favor of centralized control. When the center failed, the entire system collapsed. Complexity also increased vulnerability to cascading failure. A drought might begin as an agricultural problem, but it quickly became a political crisis, then a military one, then a social one. Each layer of complexity amplified the impact of the original stress. Instead of absorbing shocks, cities transmitted them through tightly coupled systems. This is why smaller, less complex settlements often survived periods that destroyed major cities. Villages could adapt locally. Families adjusted planting strategies. Communities reorganized leadership informally. Cities, bound by infrastructure and hierarchy, had fewer options. Another consequence of overcomplexity was dependence on specialists. Ancient cities relied on artisans, engineers, priests, scribes, merchants, and administrators. When populations declined or trade faltered, these specialists disappeared. Without engineers, canals failed. Without scribes, administration collapsed. Without priests, rituals that legitimized power ceased. The loss of specialists weakened cities rapidly. Ironically, the very features that defined civilization made cities vulnerable. Monumental architecture required constant upkeep. Roads and sewers needed repair. Defensive walls required garrisons. When labor shortages emerged, maintenance stopped. Infrastructure decayed. Living conditions worsened. Decline accelerated. Complexity also created psychological distance between rulers and citizens. In early urban centers, leadership was often personal and local. In large, mature cities, governance became abstract. Laws replaced relationships. Taxes replaced reciprocity. When crises struck, this distance fueled resentment and disengagement. People no longer felt invested in preserving systems that no longer served them. Religious complexity played a role as well. Elaborate ritual systems required resources and participation. When crises disrupted ritual calendars or offerings, belief systems destabilized. If gods failed to respond, faith eroded. This undermined political authority, since rulers often claimed divine support. At the same time, elites often responded to crisis by increasing complexity rather than reducing it. New regulations were imposed, new rituals were introduced, new monuments were built to reinforce legitimacy. These responses consumed resources and labor when flexibility was needed most. Instead of adapting, systems doubled down on failing structures. Archaeological evidence frequently shows an increase in ceremonial construction near the end of city life. Rather than focusing on food production or infrastructure repair, elites invested in display. This pattern appears in Maya cities, Mesopotamian centers, and late Roman urban spaces. It reflects a belief that restoring order symbolically could reverse material decline. It rarely worked. Once complexity reached a tipping point, collapse could be surprisingly rapid. Cities that had stood for centuries emptied within decades. The systems holding them together unraveled almost simultaneously. What remains in the archaeological record is not gradual decay, but sudden absence. This leads to a sobering insight. Collapse is often invisible until it is inevitable. Cities can appear stable right up until the moment they are abandoned. Their complexity masks fragility. Their size hides vulnerability. Their monuments give an illusion of permanence. But collapse is not the same as extinction. When cities disappeared, people adapted by simplifying. They formed smaller communities. They relied on local resources. They reduced hierarchy. Life continued, often with greater resilience than before. Understanding this challenges modern assumptions about progress. Bigger is not always stronger. More advanced is not always more sustainable. Complexity demands resilience, and without it, success becomes a trap. As we move toward the final sections of this documentary, the question becomes unavoidable. What lessons do these vanished cities offer beyond historical curiosity? Why does this pattern repeat across time and culture? And why do modern societies still struggle with the same vulnerabilities that destroyed ancient cities? In the next part, we will step back and compare these collapses side by side, identifying the repeating warning signs that appear again and again before cities vanish, and revealing how ancient disappearances form a blueprint for understanding collapse itself. When we step back and place vanished ancient cities side by side, a striking pattern begins to emerge. These were not isolated tragedies scattered randomly across history. They followed recognizable sequences, different cultures, different geographies, different eras, yet the same warning signs appear again and again, quietly building long before streets emptied and monuments fell silent. The first signal is always strain rather than collapse. Cities rarely failed at their peak. They failed after periods of stress that went unaddressed. Food systems were pushed to their limits. Water sources became unreliable. Trade networks weakened. These pressures alone were survivable, but together they exposed deeper weaknesses. The city entered a state of permanent crisis management, reacting rather than adapting. As strain continued, resilience declined. Infrastructure aged without repair. Irrigation channels clogged, roads cracked, drainage systems failed. These were not dramatic failures, but slow degradations that made daily life harder. Each unrepaired system increased the cost of living in the city and reduced the benefits of staying. At first, only the most vulnerable left. Over time, even the privileged began to reconsider. The next recurring sign is elite miscalculation. Leadership in many ancient cities responded to stress by protecting status rather than strengthening systems. Monumental projects continued even as food shortages worsened. Rituals intensified while infrastructure decayed. Authority focused on maintaining appearances instead of addressing root problems. This widened the gap between rulers and citizens, accelerating social disengagement. Once trust eroded, cooperation declined. Public works depended on shared effort. When people stopped believing those efforts served them, participation dropped. Labor shortages followed. Maintenance ceased. Systems that required collective action failed rapidly once that action stopped. Cities are cooperative machines. When cooperation breaks down, the machine grinds to a halt. Another consistent pattern is rigidity. Cities that survived crisis were flexible. They decentralized authority, diversified economies, and adjusted settlement patterns. Cities that collapsed clung to old structures. They relied on the same crops, the same trade routes, the same power arrangements, even as conditions changed. Rigidity turned manageable stress into fatal shock. Environmental pressure almost always appears in the background. Droughts, floods, soil depletion, and climate shifts did not destroy cities on their own, but they triggered every other weakness. Environmental change exposed overdependence on fragile systems. It punished overpopulation. It tested adaptability. Cities that ignored environmental limits paid the price. Migration emerges as another shared feature. Collapse was rarely an all-at-once event. It unfolded as waves of departure. First came farmers seeking better land. Then merchants followed, shifting trade. Then administrators relocated. Finally, the remaining population found itself isolated, unable to sustain the city alone. By the time abandonment was visible, it was already irreversible. What is perhaps most unsettling is how rational these choices were. People did not abandon cities out of ignorance or fear alone. They left because staying no longer made sense. The city stopped offering security, opportunity, or meaning. Collapse, in this light, was not madness, it was decision. Cities also failed faster when they were deeply interconnected. Highly connected trade networks spread risk as efficiently as wealth. When one region faltered, others felt the shock. Interdependence increased prosperity, but reduced insulation. The fall of one node weakened the entire system. This explains why regional collapses are so common in ancient history. Entire networks unraveled together. When trade failed, political alliances dissolved. When alliances dissolved, security vanished. When security vanished, migration followed. Collapse cascaded. Yet there is one more pattern that stands out above all others. Cities did not disappear because people stopped caring. They disappeared because the systems that sustained care stopped working. When effort no longer produced stability, people conserved energy for survival elsewhere. This reframes collapse not as failure but as recalibration. People did not cling to ruins out of loyalty. They adapted, they reorganized. They chose smaller, simpler forms of life that offered greater control. In many cases, living standards improved after leaving cities behind. The archaeological silence of abandoned cities often masks this reality. Ruins suggest tragedy. Absence suggests loss. But beyond the city walls, life continued. New settlements formed. Cultures transformed. Civilizations evolved. The tragedy lies not in abandonment, but in denial. Cities that collapsed hardest were those that refused to change until it was too late. They invested in complexity when they needed flexibility. They centralized when they needed diversity. They focused on symbols when they needed systems. This brings us to the most important question of all. If these patterns are so consistent, Why were they repeated so often? Why did societies fail to learn from earlier collapses? The answer lies in the illusion of permanence. Cities feel eternal while they stand. Their monuments suggest stability. Their institutions feel unshakable. This illusion blinds societies to fragility. Every generation believes its city is different, more advanced, more resilient, less vulnerable than those before. And every generation underestimates the speed at which systems can unravel once tipping points are crossed. As we approach the final parts of this documentary, the focus shifts from ancient ruins to modern relevance. What do these vanished cities warn us about today? Which warning signs are universal, and which collapses are we repeating without realizing it? In the next part, we will examine how ancient disappearances mirror modern urban vulnerabilities, revealing why the study of lost cities is not about the past at all, but about the future. When ancient cities disappeared, their ruins became silent warnings, but those warnings were rarely heard by the societies that followed. The uncomfortable truth is that the forces that erased cities thousands of years ago did not vanish with them. They persist, reshaped by new technologies and larger populations, but fundamentally unchanged. Studying vanished ancient cities is not an exercise in nostalgia, it is a mirror held up to the present. One of the most striking parallels between ancient and modern urban systems is dependence. Ancient cities depended on stable water, food, trade, and governance. Modern cities depend on the same foundations, only scaled up to unprecedented levels. The difference is not vulnerability, but visibility. Modern systems appear robust because they are fast and global. In reality, this speed increases fragility. Ancient trade networks collapsed when drought disrupted agriculture or when political instability blocked routes. Modern supply chains are similarly exposed. A disruption in one region can ripple across continents within days. Just as ancient cities relied on imported grain or metal, modern cities rely on fuel, food, and materials sourced from distant places. The illusion of abundance masks the reality of dependency. Climate stress remains one of the most powerful destabilizing forces. Ancient droughts triggered migration, unrest, and collapse. Today, climate change threatens water systems, food production, and coastal infrastructure on a global scale. The difference is scale, not mechanism. Rising seas, heat waves, and extreme weather strain urban systems in ways that echo ancient failures. Infrastructure decay is another shared vulnerability. Ancient cities collapsed when roads, canals, and drainage systems went unrepaired. Modern cities face similar challenges as aging infrastructure struggles to support growing populations. Deferred maintenance, resource shortages, and political gridlock create conditions eerily similar to those seen in late-stage ancient cities. Social inequality also remains a destabilizing force. Ancient elites insulated themselves while common people bore the cost of crisis. When trust eroded, cities unraveled. Modern cities face comparable divides. When resources, safety, and opportunity concentrate at the top, social cohesion weakens. Without cohesion, resilience collapses. One of the most powerful lessons from ancient disappearances is how quickly confidence can evaporate. Cities did not empty because conditions became unbearable overnight. They emptied because belief in improvement vanished. Once people stopped trusting that tomorrow would be better than today, they left if they could. Modern cities are not immune to this psychology. Confidence sustains systems as much as infrastructure does. Another recurring pattern is overconfidence in technology. Ancient cities believed their irrigation systems, walls, or gods would protect them. Modern cities trust complex technologies, data systems, and economic models. These tools are powerful, but they are not guarantees. When technology outpaces adaptability, it becomes a source of risk rather than security. Yet ancient history also offers hope. Not every city collapsed. Some adapted, some restructured, some transformed rather than disappeared. These successes share common traits: flexibility, decentralization, diversity of resources, and inclusive governance. Cities that encouraged local adaptation and shared responsibility weathered crises better than those that imposed rigid control. Modern urban resilience depends on the same principles: systems that distribute risk, empower communities, and prioritize long-term stability over short-term growth are more likely to endure. Ancient cities failed when they pursued expansion without resilience. Modern cities face the same choice. Perhaps the most profound lesson of all is this: collapse is not a moment, it is a process. It unfolds quietly through neglected maintenance, ignored warnings, and postponed reform. By the time collapse becomes visible, reversal is often impossible. The ruins of ancient cities are not just remnants of the past, they are records of decisions. Each abandoned street reflects choices made decades earlier. Each fallen wall represents priorities misplaced. Each empty plaza tells a story of adaptation delayed. The purpose of studying these disappearances is not fear, but foresight. Ancient people were not foolish. They made rational choices based on what they knew and valued. The same will be true of modern societies. The question is not whether cities are vulnerable, but whether we recognize that vulnerability in time. As we approach the conclusion of this documentary, one final question remains. If collapse is so common, so predictable, and so deeply human, why do we continue to build cities at all? Why return again and again to the same patterns that produced ruins? The answer lies in the human drive for connection, creativity, and collective life. Cities are risk-taken in pursuit of possibility. They concentrate innovation, culture, and opportunity. They also concentrate danger. This tension has defined urban life for thousands of years. In the final part, we will bring all of these threads together, examining why cities continue to rise despite their fragility, why disappearance does not mean failure, and why the story of vanished ancient cities ultimately reveals something hopeful about human resilience rather than despair. When we look across the ruins of vanished ancient cities, it is tempting to frame their disappearance as failure, as cautionary tales carved into stone. But this view misses a deeper truth. Cities did not disappear because humanity made a mistake by building them. They disappeared because cities are experiments, bold, ambitious attempts to organize human life at scale in environments that are constantly changing. Some experiments succeed for centuries, others end sooner. None are permanent. Throughout history, people continued to build cities even after witnessing collapse elsewhere. This persistence reveals something essential about human nature. Cities offer possibilities that no other form of settlement can provide. They concentrate knowledge, foster creativity, enable cooperation among strangers, and generate cultural momentum. Even when cities fail, the benefits they produce outweigh the risks, at least for a time. This is why the disappearance of ancient cities did not end civilization. It reshaped it. People carried skills, beliefs, technologies, and memories into new settlements. When Maya cities were abandoned, Maya culture endured. When Indus cities dissolved, their people adapted to new ways of living. When Roman cities declined, fragments of Roman law, language, and engineering survived and re-emerged later. Collapse did not erase humanity's progress. it redistributed it. Seen this way, abandoned cities are not endpoints, they are transitions. Each one marks a moment when a society chose to reorganize itself rather than remain trapped in a failing system. This reframing challenges modern assumptions about collapse as catastrophe. In many cases, collapse was survival. What made ancient cities vulnerable was not ignorance, but success. They optimized for the conditions that made them powerful. When those conditions changed, optimization became rigidity. This is a paradox repeated across time. Systems built for efficiency often struggle with change. Systems built for resilience accept inefficiency in exchange for adaptability. Ancient cities teach us that resilience is not about preventing failure, it is about limiting how much failure matters. Smaller communities could survive the loss of a city. Flexible economies could absorb shocks. Diverse food systems could endure drought. Shared governance could maintain trust under stress. The most resilient societies were not those with the largest cities or grandest monuments. They were those that allowed people to adapt locally while remaining connected culturally. They balanced central coordination with local autonomy. They treated cities as tools, not identities. This distinction matters because many ancient cities collapsed when people could no longer imagine life outside the urban system they had built. Leaders invested everything in preserving the city itself, even as its foundations crumbled. Resources were poured into monuments, rituals, and authority, while adaptation was postponed. By the time change came, it arrived as abandonment. Modern societies face a similar challenge. Cities today are larger, more complex, and more interconnected than ever before. They are also more dependent on fragile systems operating at global scale. Ancient collapses remind us that scale magnifies consequence. When cities work, they transform the world. When they fail, the shock is immense. Yet the lesson is not to fear cities, it is to understand them honestly. Cities thrive when they remain adaptable, inclusive, and responsive to environmental limits. They fail when growth becomes an end in itself and resilience is treated as optional. Perhaps the most powerful insight ancient cities offer is humility. Even the most advanced societies of the past believed they had solved the challenges of urban life. Their ruins remind us that no solution is permanent. Conditions change, systems age, assumptions expire. And yet, despite this impermanence, humanity keeps building. Not because we forget collapse, but because we understand renewal. Every ruined city stands as proof that people survived, adapted, and continued. Civilization is not a straight line of progress. It is a series of rises, falls, and reinventions. The silence of abandoned streets does not mean history ended there. It means it moved on. When archaeologists uncover a lost city, they do not find an ending. They find a chapter break. The people who lived there carried their lives forward, often wiser, often changed, but still building new communities shaped by old lessons. The disappearance of ancient cities reminds us that permanence is an illusion, but continuity is real. Structures fall, societies evolve, humanity persists. And perhaps that is the most hopeful conclusion of all. Cities disappear, but people do not. The ruins we see today are not warnings against civilization, but evidence of its resilience. They show us that even when systems fail, adaptation continues. Even when cities fall silent, life reorganizes. In the end, ancient cities did not vanish because humanity was fragile. They vanished because humanity was flexible enough to leave, to change, and to begin again. And as long as that capacity remains, the story of cities, rising, falling, and rising again, will continue. There is one final layer to the disappearance of ancient cities that deserves careful attention because it explains why these stories continue to resonate so powerfully today. Beyond climate, war, economics, and complexity lies something quieter but equally decisive: perception. Cities did not disappear only when they became physically unlivable. They disappeared when people stopped believing in them. Belief is an invisible infrastructure. Ancient cities depended on shared confidence that the city would endure. That effort invested today would pay off tomorrow, that the systems governing daily life were worth maintaining. When that belief weakened, everything else followed. Infrastructure decayed faster. Cooperation declined. Migration accelerated. Collapse, in many cases, was psychological before it was material. Archaeologists often notice that the final phases of ancient cities show strange contradictions. Some buildings remain carefully maintained while others crumble. Certain rituals continue even as neighborhoods empty. Coins are still minted while markets shrink. These inconsistencies reveal societies struggling to reconcile fading confidence with ingrained habit. People went through the motions long after they stopped believing in long-term recovery. This moment is critical. Cities rarely collapse at the peak of crisis. They collapse when people conclude that the crisis will not end. Hope is the final structural support. When it fails, abandonment becomes inevitable. Ancient rulers understood this intuitively, even if they could not articulate it. This is why they invested so heavily in spectacle during times of decline. Monuments grew larger, rituals became more elaborate. Authority was displayed more aggressively. These were not signs of strength, but attempts to restore belief. When those efforts failed, collapse accelerated. What we see in the ruins is not sudden panic, but quiet resignation. People did not flee screaming. They packed, relocated, and rebuilt elsewhere. This choice was not weakness. It was realism. Understanding this reframes how we interpret disappearance. Cities did not always fall because they were destroyed. They fell because people made a collective decision, often without coordination, that staying no longer made sense. This decision was shaped by countless personal calculations, but its result was unmistakable. This also explains why some cities were never reoccupied, even when conditions improved. Once belief is broken, it is difficult to restore. A city associated with instability, danger, or failure becomes psychologically unattractive. New generations prefer fresh foundations rather than inherited risk. The ruins that remain today are therefore not just physical remains, but emotional artifacts. They represent moments when societies reached the limit of what they were willing to endure in one place. There is a tendency to imagine ancient people as trapped by tradition, unable to adapt or imagine alternatives. The evidence suggests the opposite. They were capable of walking away from immense investments when necessary. They did not cling blindly to failing systems. In many cases, they chose mobility over monumentality. This capacity for departure may be one of humanity's greatest survival traits. Cities collapse, landscapes change, resources shift. Societies that can relocate, reorganize, and reinvent themselves survive. Those that cannot become ruins. Seen through this lens, the disappearance of ancient cities is not primarily a story of doom. It is a story of thresholds. When the costs of staying outweighed the benefits, people moved on. Civilization did not end. It flowed elsewhere. The mistake modern observers often make is equating permanence with success. Ancient cities remind us that longevity is not the only measure of achievement. Some cities burned brightly for a few centuries and left lasting cultural legacies. Others endured longer but contributed less. Duration alone does not define significance. The Maya cities reshaped astronomy, mathematics, and art even as they were abandoned. Indus Valley cities pioneered urban planning and sanitation whose principles still influence modern design. Mesopotamian cities gave rise to writing, law, and administration. Their disappearance did not erase their impact. It amplified it. This leads to a final realization. The disappearance of ancient cities did not mean those societies failed to understand their world. It meant they understood it well enough to respond when conditions changed beyond repair. Collapse was not ignorance. It was adaptation under constraint. When we walk through ancient ruins today, we are not witnessing failure frozen in stone. We are standing inside a moment of decision, a moment when people weighed loyalty against survival and chose life elsewhere. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Cities are tools, not destinies. They are means of organizing human effort, not ends in themselves. When they serve humanity, they flourish. When they cease to do so, humanity moves on. The ancient world is filled with vanished cities because the ancient world was dynamic, experimental, and responsive. Our fascination with disappearance reveals our own anxiety about permanence. We want cities to last forever because we want stability to be guaranteed. Ancient history offers no such guarantee. Instead, it offers something more honest: resilience through change. As long as humans remain willing to adapt, to question systems, and to leave behind what no longer works, civilization will continue, sometimes in familiar forms, sometimes in new ones, but always moving. The ruins scattered across deserts, jungles, and coastlines are not warnings against building cities. They are reminders to build wisely, to remain flexible, and to understand that the true strength of civilization lies not in stone walls, but in human adaptability. And perhaps that is why ancient cities still speak to us, not because they disappeared, but because, in their disappearance, they reveal how humanity survives. When ancient cities disappeared, they did not simply leave behind ruins. They left behind a pattern that repeats so reliably it borders on inevitability. This pattern does not depend on culture, geography, or era. It emerges wherever human populations concentrate, systems grow complex, and success creates dependency. Understanding this pattern forces us to confront a difficult reality. Cities are not permanent achievements, but living systems that must constantly renegotiate their relationship with the environment, economy, and society that sustain them. One of the most persistent illusions surrounding cities is the belief that growth equals stability. Ancient cities expanded outward and upward, adding populations, infrastructure, and administrative layers in response to prosperity. This expansion felt like progress, yet it quietly increased vulnerability. Larger populations required more food, more water, more energy, and more coordination. Margins shrank, flexibility diminished. What had once been surplus became necessity. When external conditions shifted even slightly, the consequences multiplied rapidly, pushing cities toward thresholds they could not easily retreat from. What history shows us repeatedly is that collapse rarely begins with catastrophe. It begins with normalization of strain. Droughts become expected, shortages become seasonal, infrastructure failures become routine. Leaders promise restoration while postponing fundamental change. People adapt just enough to survive, but not enough to restore resilience. This prolonged state of managed decline is far more dangerous than sudden disaster because it dulls urgency while steadily eroding capacity. By the time abandonment occurs, the decision feels inevitable rather than dramatic. Another recurring theme in vanished cities is the misalignment between complexity and control. As cities matured, They accumulated rules, institutions, and hierarchies designed to manage risk. Ironically, these same systems often slowed response when rapid adaptation was needed. Decision-making became centralized and bureaucratic. Local solutions were discouraged in favor of uniform policies. Innovation stagnated. When crisis demanded experimentation, cities doubled down on tradition instead. This rigidity transformed manageable stress into irreversible collapse. The archaeological record captures this moment with eerie consistency. We see cities continuing familiar practices long after those practices stopped working. The same crops are planted despite declining yields. The same trade routes are protected despite dwindling traffic. The same rituals are performed despite clear evidence that conditions have changed. This persistence is not stupidity. It is the natural result of systems optimized for stability rather than change. Cities reward predictability until unpredictability becomes fatal. One of the most telling signs of impending disappearance is the breakdown of maintenance. Roads crack, water systems clog, public buildings decay. These failures are often interpreted as consequences of collapse, but they are better understood as causes. Maintenance is a measure of confidence. When people believe a city has a future, they invest in preserving it. When belief falters, maintenance becomes wasteful effort. Once this shift occurs, decline accelerates quickly because infrastructure failure directly worsens daily life and drives migration. Migration itself is often misunderstood. It is not evidence of panic or disorder, but of rational adaptation. Ancient people were not rooted to place by ideology. They moved when conditions demanded it. Cities disappeared because people left, not because they died en masse. This distinction matters because it reframes collapse as a human choice rather than an external verdict. Abandonment was often the most logical response to declining returns on effort. Another factor linking ancient disappearances is the failure to distribute risk. Cities concentrated population and resources in single locations, making them efficient but brittle. When one system failed, everything felt the impact. Societies that survived tended to spread risk across multiple settlements, diversified food sources, and decentralized authority. Cities that collapsed often placed too many functions in too few places, leaving them exposed to cascading failure. This is why collapse so often appears sudden in hindsight. The processes leading to it unfolded over decades, but the visible moment of abandonment occurred quickly once thresholds were crossed. A city could lose half its population within a generation. Markets could vanish in a few years. Infrastructure could fail in a single season without maintenance. Collapse feels abrupt because systems do not degrade linearly. They hold until they break. What makes this especially relevant is how similar these dynamics are across time. The technologies change, the scale increases, but the structure of vulnerability remains the same. Dependence, rigidity, inequality, and overconfidence form a repeating cycle. Ancient cities did not fall because they lacked intelligence or ingenuity. They fell because they underestimated how quickly success could turn into fragility. This realization does not diminish ancient achievement, it humanizes it. These cities were built by people solving real problems with the tools and knowledge available to them. Their disappearance reflects the limits of foresight, not the absence of wisdom. In many cases, people adapted as best they could until adaptation required leaving the city behind entirely. Perhaps the most profound insight offered by vanished cities is that resilience is not about preservation at all costs. It is about knowing when to change form. Cities that disappeared were not necessarily failures. They were stages in longer human trajectories. Their ruins are not endpoints, but evidence of movement. As we approach the final parts of this documentary, the focus shifts from explanation to reflection. If ancient cities disappeared because they became too rigid, too dependent, and too confident in permanence, then the question is not whether collapse is avoidable, but whether it can be navigated wisely. History suggests that collapse becomes destructive only when societies refuse to acknowledge it as a process rather than an event. In the next part, we will draw together all of these threads into a final synthesis, examining what ancient disappearances ultimately teach us about survival, adaptability, and the enduring human capacity to rebuild after leaving even the greatest cities behind. By the time ancient cities were finally abandoned, the forces that shaped their disappearance were already deeply embedded in everyday life. Collapse did not arrive as a single moment of recognition, but as a gradual recalibration of expectations. People adjusted to scarcity, learned to live with broken systems, and slowly lowered their assumptions about what the city could provide. In this way, disappearance was not an ending imposed from the outside, but the culmination of countless small decisions made under pressure. What stands out across ancient examples is how rarely societies chose radical reform early enough to reverse decline. Instead, they relied on familiar solutions because familiarity felt safer than uncertainty. This tendency is deeply human. When systems begin to fail, the instinct is to reinforce them rather than rethink them. Ancient rulers increased taxation to compensate for shortages, expanded ceremonial authority to reinforce legitimacy, and invested in visible symbols of continuity to reassure populations. These actions temporarily stabilized perception, but they drained the very resources needed for adaptation. At the same time, ordinary people adapted in quieter ways. Families diversified food sources, shifted occupations, and reduced reliance on centralized systems. These strategies improved survival at the household level but weakened cities collectively. As people relied less on urban institutions, those institutions lost relevance. The city became a burden rather than a support structure. This divergence between elite strategy and popular adaptation widened the gap between governance and lived reality, accelerating abandonment. One of the most important insights from vanished cities is that collapse often unfolded unevenly. Different parts of a city declined at different rates. Central districts might remain active while peripheral neighborhoods emptied. Administrative buildings might continue functioning long after markets failed. Religious centers might persist even as residential areas vanished. This unevenness created the illusion of survival long after the city had passed its point of no return. Archaeologists frequently observe this pattern in late-stage urban layers. Signs of occupation linger in isolated pockets while surrounding areas fall silent. This fragmentation undermined collective response. Without shared experience of crisis, coordination became impossible. People made decisions based on local conditions, not citywide strategy. The result was piecemeal departure rather than organized recovery. Another crucial element was generational change. Children born during periods of decline did not remember prosperity. Their expectations were shaped by scarcity, instability, and reduced opportunity. For them, the city was not a symbol of greatness, but a constraint. Migration offered possibility. Staying offered continuity of hardship. As younger generations chose mobility, the city's demographic base eroded further. This generational shift helps explain why some cities were never revived, even when conditions later improved. Once the population that remembered the city's former value was gone, there was no emotional or cultural incentive to return. Memory itself became fragmented. What remained were ruins without meaning, landscapes without attachment. In many cases, disappearance was accompanied by cultural simplification rather than collapse. Monumental architecture ceased. Writing systems became less common. Trade networks narrowed, but basic skills persisted. Agriculture continued, craft traditions survived in altered forms. Social life reorganized around smaller, more manageable communities. From the perspective of individual survival, these changes were often improvements. This challenges the assumption that urban collapse equates to civilizational failure. What failed was a specific organizational model, not the people who lived within it. Cities are one way of organizing society, not the only way. When conditions no longer favored dense urban life, ancient people adapted by choosing alternatives that better matched their environment. Another overlooked factor in disappearance is exhaustion. Cities demanded constant effort. Maintaining infrastructure, managing politics, defending territory, and sustaining rituals required continuous labor and coordination. Over time, especially under stress, the cost of maintaining the city exceeded its benefits. Leaving was not dramatic, it was relief. This exhaustion is visible in the archaeological record through declining craftsmanship, reduced building quality, and fewer signs of innovation. These are not signs of ignorance, they are signs of fatigue. Societies pushed to their limits conserve energy where they can. Cities that disappeared were often those that demanded too much for too long. As we step back, a sobering pattern becomes clear. Ancient cities rarely failed because they were unimportant. They failed because they mattered deeply. They concentrated ambition, identity, and investment. When they became unsustainable, the emotional cost of leaving was high, but the practical necessity was higher. This understanding reframes the ruins we see today. They are not monuments to collapse alone, but to decision. They mark the point at which societies chose adaptability over attachment. In doing so, they preserved life at the expense of place. As we approach the final part of this documentary, the focus shifts from analysis to synthesis. What ultimately do vanished ancient cities teach us about human survival? Not about avoiding collapse entirely, but about navigating it without destruction, about recognizing when systems must change form rather than be preserved at all costs. In the final part, we will draw together these insights into a single conclusion, examining why the disappearance of cities is not the end of civilization, but one of the ways civilization renews itself again and again across history. When all the evidence is placed side by side, when the ruins of vanished cities are viewed not as isolated mysteries, but as part of a single human pattern, a deeper truth comes into focus. Ancient cities did not disappear because civilization failed. They disappeared because civilization refused to stand still. What we call collapse was often a transition, sometimes painful, sometimes disruptive, but rarely meaningless. Cities fell silent not because humanity lost its way, but because the conditions that once made those cities thrive no longer existed. The mistake modern observers often make is assuming that permanence is the natural goal of human settlement. In reality, permanence has never been humanity's strength. Adaptability has. Ancient people lived in environments that shifted constantly. Rivers changed course, rainfall patterns altered, soil fertility declined, trade routes moved, political centers relocated. Under these conditions, insisting that a city remain fixed forever would have been far more dangerous than abandoning it. Leaving was not surrender, it was strategy. Every vanished city represents a moment when people collectively, though rarely consciously, acknowledged that effort was no longer producing security. That realization did not arrive overnight. It emerged slowly, through failed harvests that became routine, through repairs that were postponed again and again, through markets that shrank and rituals that felt increasingly hollow. At some point, the city stopped feeling like protection and began to feel like exposure. When that psychological shift occurred, the physical disappearance of the city soon followed. This is why collapse often appears sudden in hindsight. Archaeological layers show vibrant life followed by silence, but that silence masks decades of erosion. Cities rarely fell at the height of crisis. They fell when people stopped believing recovery was possible. Hope, more than walls or water systems, was the final infrastructure holding cities together. When it failed, no monument could replace it. What remains striking is how rarely ancient cities were abandoned in chaos. The popular image of collapse imagines screaming crowds, burning streets, and desperate flight. In reality, most disappearances were quiet. People packed what they could carry. They dismantled usable materials. They relocated to safer ground, more fertile land, or emerging centers of opportunity. Life continued, just not there. The ruins we see today are not scenes of annihilation, but places where movement occurred. This reframing matters because it challenges the idea that collapse equals failure. What failed was not humanity's ability to survive, but a specific configuration of social organization. Cities are tools, not guarantees. When a tool stops working, discarding it is not defeat, it is intelligence. Ancient cities concentrated risk as much as opportunity. They depended on stable inputs of food, water, labor, and trust. As long as these flowed, cities amplified human potential. When any of these faltered, the same concentration amplified vulnerability. Collapse was not caused by a single mistake, but by the accumulation of dependencies that could no longer be sustained. One of the most powerful lessons from vanished cities is how deeply success itself contributed to fragility. Cities grew because they worked. They attracted people, wealth, and influence. But growth narrowed margins. Surplus became necessity. Flexibility became rigidity. Systems optimized for prosperity struggled to adapt to scarcity. The qualities that made cities great also made them brittle. This pattern appears again and again. Maya cities expanded ceremonial construction even as drought intensified. Mesopotamian cities pushed irrigation beyond ecological limits. Roman cities grew dependent on distant grain supplies. Indus Valley cities relied on river systems that eventually shifted. None of these societies were ignorant of risk. They simply underestimated how quickly conditions could change once thresholds were crossed. Yet despite this, ancient people repeatedly demonstrated something remarkable: the ability to walk away from enormous investments. Leaving a city meant abandoning homes, temples, infrastructure, and identity. It required breaking emotional attachment and redefining belonging. That ancient populations did this again and again speaks to a survival instinct stronger than loyalty to stone. This ability to detach is perhaps humanity's most underappreciated strength. Civilizations did not survive because cities endured. They survived because people knew when cities no longer served them. In that sense, ruins are not monuments to stubbornness, but to discernment. Another uncomfortable truth emerges here. Collapse often hurt elites most. Cities concentrated political authority, wealth, and status. When cities failed, those advantages dissolved. Ordinary people, already accustomed to adapting, often fared better in decentralized environments. This may explain why resistance to change often came from the top rather than the bottom. Elites had the most to lose from abandonment, even when abandonment was inevitable. This tension delayed adaptation. Leaders attempted to preserve cities through display, coercion, and tradition rather than transformation. When those strategies failed, collapse accelerated. The lesson is clear across history. Systems that prioritize appearance over function fail faster than those willing to change form. As we look across the ancient world, from jungle-covered pyramids to desert-buried streets, a sobering realization emerges. There is no final city, no perfect urban form immune to time, environment, or human limitation. Cities rise because conditions allow them to rise. They fall when those conditions change. This is not a flaw in civilization. It is its rhythm. And yet, despite knowing this, humanity continues to build cities, not out of ignorance, but out of ambition. Cities allow cooperation at scales impossible elsewhere. They generate culture, knowledge, and innovation. They are engines of possibility. Ancient people accepted their risks because the rewards were real. Modern societies do the same. The ruins left behind are not warnings against building. They are reminders to remain flexible. They tell us that resilience is not about making cities eternal, but about making societies capable of transition. When cities become ends rather than means, collapse becomes destructive. When they remain tools, collapse becomes survivable. The most haunting aspect of vanished cities is not their emptiness, but their familiarity. The forces that shaped their disappearance, environmental strain, inequality, overdependence, rigidity, misplaced confidence, are not relics of the past. They are human tendencies. The ancient world did not collapse because it was primitive. It collapsed because it was human. But so too was its recovery. After every abandoned city, new forms of life emerged. New settlements formed. New systems evolved. Humanity did not start over from nothing. It carried forward lessons, technologies, and stories. Civilization did not move in straight lines, but in waves. This is why the disappearance of ancient cities ultimately offers something more profound than warning. It offers perspective. It reminds us that survival is not about preserving structures, but about preserving adaptability. It shows us that loss is not the end of progress, but often its catalyst. The stones left behind do not accuse us. They inform us. They tell us that civilization is strongest not when it resists change, but when it anticipates it, not when it clings to permanence, but when it accepts impermanence as the price of growth. Ancient cities disappeared because humanity moved forward, and as long as humanity continues to adapt, to question, and to rebuild, cities will rise again, different in form, familiar in ambition, and always temporary. That is not a failure of civilization. That is civilization working exactly as it always has.